I would like to welcome you today on behalf of GAPLA to our online talk on migration law. I should say again, we had some previous talks on migration law, but as this topic is always moving, we don't run out of things to talk about in this area. For those who don't know GAPLA, we are a non-for-profit association of lawyers in different countries, including Germany, Austria, Australia, New Zealand. And we offer a platform to exchange ideas and experiences and information between our members and colleagues around the world. Now, on camera, you should see our board members, Michael Kobras, Volker, Linden, Juliane Werther-Bontje, and myself. Also our speakers of today. So we've got Martin Hildebrand, who's a special counsel and an accredited specialist in immigration law at Phillip Yip Associates in Sydney. Welcome, Martin, and thank you for being here today. And we have Alexander Nadiraschwili, who has volunteered to provide some comments from the German perspective. Alexander is an experienced migration and tax lawyer in Germany, a partner at Geismar Rechtsanwälte in Berlin. So thank you, Alexander, once again for joining us today and answering any questions about the situation in Germany. Now, our topic today is the Australian COVID-19 travel restrictions, which is a topic that is of interest to many of us on personal as well as professional levels. So I very much look forward to an interesting discussion. I should say we have disabled everybody else's cameras except for the 6 of us, just to ensure we've got a good quality of the videos. You can ask questions. Martin, if you're happy throughout your presentation, or would you prefer questions to be asked afterwards?
I think, look, we're probably best to just go through the presentation. It's not very long, so it's only about 5 to 10 minutes. And I think we should it's probably best to answer questions thereafter. And just
excellent, that makes sense. Yeah, so if everybody could hold off with their questions until after Martin's presentation, and you can ask questions by unmuting yourself, but you can also use the chat function, and Juliane and I will be monitoring your questions in that chat and try and get through as many questions as we can in our limited amount of time. So without further delay, over to you, Martin, and welcome.
Thank you for the kind introduction there, Claudia. Now, let me share my screen with you. And now, so you should all see a PowerPoint presentation now.
Yep, it's on the screen.
Here we go. So just as a bit of background, so in Australia, we got a population of about 25 million. And up until COVID hit, and we had about, well, had more than 20,000 people, 20 million people arriving in Australia each year. So we had about 10 million short-term visitors that arrived, and around a bit more than 10 million Australians that returned from overseas after they had gone on holidays. When COVID hit, Australia basically closed its borders in March 2020. And since then, the travel volume has basically decreased to about 1% of the numbers that we previously had. So when coming, just as a brief overview there, in order to come to Australia, if you're a non-citizen, you require a visa to lawfully travel to Australia, remain in Australia. So there are permanent visas, temporary visas, as well as so-called bridging visas. For most visas, amongst other criteria, you need to show that you're of good character and have good health. Now, due to COVID-19, we have seen significant delays with visa processing. Some applications are basically not processed at all. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, how it may be possible to trigger processing of applications in the current circumstances. So, as I mentioned, in March 2020, Australia basically closed its borders. I think, see, when COVID first hit, the first people that were restricted from coming to Australia were actually from China. And at the time when that happened, I said, like, I couldn't believe it actually, you know, so because I thought that it was rather discriminatory. And I was saying to my colleagues, oh, you know, I mean, this is really, really bad, you know, so I can't believe this is happening. Sure enough, this would never happen to a country like Italy. Well, how wrong I was at the time, you know, so because only a couple of weeks after my comment, our border was closed to travelers from Italy as well. So how our border restrictions basically work is that it's not sufficient now to obtain a visa to come to Australia. So in addition to your visa, you also must obtain an incoming travel exemption. So this exemption needs to be obtained if you're the holder of a temporary visa. So there are some, basically you've got exempt categories and there are individual exemptions, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. So that's the incoming side. For people who want to leave Australia, we've got restrictions as well. So whilst temporary visa holders have got no problems leaving the country, Australian citizens and permanent residents are generally prohibited from leaving Australia at the moment. So it's basically the flip side of the coin. So Australian citizens and permanent residents can travel to Australia without having to obtain a permission to do so. And whereas Australian citizens and permanent residents are not allowed to leave Australia. And for temporary visa holders, it's exactly the opposite. This is just to give you an idea of how this looks in terms of numbers. So that's just a slide from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, data on short-term visitor arrivals in Australia. So that's for this for the month of December. So if you have a look at that, so you'll see that in December 2019, we had more than 140,000 people arriving from New Zealand alone. And then in December 2020, that number had dropped to maybe about 2,000. And the most people coming to Australia at the moment are from New Zealand because we actually have what's called a travel bubble with New Zealand. So there are no, so this travel exemption regime doesn't apply to people coming from New Zealand or for anyone who has been in New Zealand for more than 2 weeks prior to arriving in Australia. Now let's have a look at the exemptions that are available. So there are so-called exempt categories. If you're a citizen or permanent resident, or a New Zealand citizen who is usually resident in Australia, then you are basically exempt from the border restrictions coming into Australia. The department also says that if you're an immediate family member of an Australian citizen or permanent resident, that you're exempt from having to obtain an exemption to the incoming travel restriction. So rules have slightly changed throughout the last 12 months here. And what I generally advise clients is that irrespective of the visa that they hold, that they actually do obtain a travel exemption prior to coming here. So as an example, if you were the holder of a partner visa and were to apply for an exemption, then you would usually get a response from the Australian Border Force Commissioner, which says, look, you're automatically exempt, you didn't have to apply. But that response is quite helpful when you try to board the plane, because apart from your visa, you can also show that, look, I've actually made contact with the relevant office and they have confirmed that I don't need a travel exemption. So just in case there are any changes, that can be very helpful. Now there are a couple of other exempt categories such as airline crew member and so on. But like I mentioned, people who've been to New Zealand for 14 days or more immediately prior to coming to Australia. But they're very, so these exempt categories are really quite small. So if you don't fall within any of the exempt categories, then you must apply for an individual, a specific travel exemption. So there are a couple of categories that the department or that the Border Force Commissioner looks at. And so, for example, if you've been invited by the Australian government or by a state government, if you're providing critical or specialist medical care, and importantly, also if you're a foreign national with critical skills or working in a critical sector in Australia, or if you are in an occupation listed on the so-called priority migration skilled occupations list. Now, unless you fall within any of the categories, or sorry, within any of those points that are outlined by the Border Force Commissioner, it is very hard to come here unless you can show that there are compelling and compassionate circumstances. But just to give you an idea, very frequently at the moment, partners of temporary visa holders who are in Australia, for example, are denied to come to Australia. So let's say they hold a work visa. The person who is working in Australia has come to Australia some time ago. They went overseas prior to the COVID outbreak due to family reasons. They have then tried to come back, and frequently they are denied entry to Australia. So they are frequently denied this travel exemption, irrespective of them holding a visa, because they don't fall within any of those points. And the department says, look, we don't think simply wanting to be together with your partner is a sufficiently compelling reason. So it's just I'm just trying to give you an idea of how difficult it can be to get this travel exemption for someone who wants to come back to Australia. It's similarly for international students, for example. So I mean, the international student market in Australia is currently in free fall, I would say, because students are basically not allowed to return to Australia. So there are some small exemptions for year 11 or 12 students, or for some people that do PhD studies, but by and large, international students are currently not allowed to return to Australia. And there's talk about, or it's frequently written in the media that lots of students are actually looking now in going to England, for example, or Canada, or trying to go to other English-speaking countries where they can still travel to. So that's something that the Australian government will have to address sooner or later, and it will be quite interesting to see how that's going to be done. Now, once you have secured your visa and your travel exemption to come to Australia, it doesn't really stop there. Yeah, so there's still a couple of other things that you need to ensure in order to be able to come to Australia. So first of all, you must actually secure a flight. And that's really significantly more difficult right now than what it used to be. So, which has to do with that the number of arrivals in Australia is basically determined by the number of quarantine spots that we have. Quarantine is arranged through the states, and the spots are very limited. So I think we've got all over Australia, we have about 3,500 to 4,000 quarantine spots per week at the moment. So what that effectively means is for airlines flying into Australia, they are given an amount of passenger numbers that they can bring in with each of the scheduled flights that they have. So most planes that come from overseas to Australia at the moment will only have about 30 to 50 passengers on a plane. Which obviously is great when you're a passenger on the plane, because then there's plenty of space. So, and there's a lesser a lesser likelihood that you will contract COVID on the plane. But nevertheless, you know, so I mean, obviously it's not really profitable for airlines at the moment. And they are working hard with the government to come up with solutions how they can have more people on their planes again. So once you've secured your flight, you've got to be aware of that there is a chance of a flight being cancelled at the last moment. So I've had that with numerous clients now, irrespective of them having booked business class flights. It's not uncommon for a flight to be cancelled at the last minute, unfortunately. It is necessary also to complete an Australian travel declaration online. That must be done at least 72 hours prior to the flight. It is now necessary in order to board a plane to have obtained a negative COVID test within 72 hours prior to the flight. It is also necessary to complete a health or quarantine declaration with the state where your plane will arrive and where you're going to undertake the quarantine. So apart from the visa and the incoming travel restrictions, there are quite a few other steps that you or your clients would need to be aware of as well. Now let's have a quick look at outgoing travel exemptions, and before we start questions in our discussion. So if you're an Australian citizen or permanent resident, you basically can't leave Australia at the moment unless you fall into an exempt category. So for example, if you're usually residing overseas, or if you can show specific reasons why you need to travel overseas. So only in very limited circumstances don't you have to apply for an exemption. In the majority of cases, Australian citizens or permanent residents currently have to apply for an exemption if they want to leave Australia. Exemptions can be granted if you have to travel for business, if you require urgent medical treatment, or if there are compelling reasons to travel overseas. Again, just to give you an example, what is not considered compelling, we had a scenario where a mother wanted to travel overseas to attend the wedding of her only child, and that request was denied. So she was going to go overseas for 3 weeks, and the department didn't let her travel at the time. Now, let's have some questions and let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that presentation. And yes, let's open the floor for questions. Just by way of background, I think this is a very interesting group because I can see in our attendees, we've got some people who actually went through the travel exemption for business and returning to Australia, having to do the quarantine in a hotel. We've got someone who's just about to embark on that journey. We've got other students from Germany who are wanting to come to Australia to do some work experience. And so I think it's an interesting crowd. So, so happy to take any questions now.
And just to filling the gap whilst the people are assembling the questions, we also got Alexander on the line. So what I thought really interesting in our prep talk was the question, how is Germany dealing with incoming travel or travel exemption? So Alexander, maybe you would like to briefly elaborate on that.
Yes, I can say a few words how Germany handles the travel restrictions. So basically there are European rules which apply now since March last year, and they are not as strict as the Australian rules are. But anyway, any persons from outside EU countries are not allowed to enter now Germany or the European Union unless they hold a temporary or permanent visa. So just visitors with a Schengen visa or visa-free travel is not allowed now, unless you are the partner of a European citizen or a permanent resident or anyone who holds a valid residence permit in a European country. So, I mean, the main difference would be that there's no restrictions for outgoing travel. So anyone in Germany can travel wherever he wants, but depending on where he's going, he has to quarantine when he comes back.
And a lot of European countries also got the PCR test requirement, I understand.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Are there any other questions to our speakers?
I actually still have a question to Alexander, not to Martin. And is
Yeah.
there also a hotel quarantine like here, or is that home quarantine?
No, in Germany it's home quarantine, and depending on what kind of visa you hold and what the reasons for your travel are, there are exemptions. So, for example, the usual quarantine is, I think it's different in any state in Germany. So, because any state makes it different, but in Berlin it's 10 days. And after 5 days, you can leave the home quarantine, do a test, and if the test is negative, you can stop the quarantine after 5 days.
Because I think Martin has to say that for many people, of course, the hotel is not only very expensive, but it's also very unpleasant.
Yes, I mean, what you have in Australia is your hotel quarantine is organized by the relevant states. And you are really locked up for 2 weeks in your room. And even though you're generally tested 2 or 3 times, and even if you return a negative test on any of those occasions, so you'll remain in quarantine, in hotel quarantine for the full 2 weeks.
Yes, and
even if you return a negative test, you still have to stay, don't you?
Yep, for the entire 2 weeks.
Yes, and I think that's a good point, Martin, because it's quite restrictive. It's not hotel quarantine in that you have to stay in the hotel. You actually are not allowed to leave your room.
Correct. Correct.
Which sounds quite restrictive, especially if you know there might be families traveling with children. So that's quite restrictive, and also I think it's happened as well that hotel quarantines had to be prolonged because there was a positive case. I think that happened in Melbourne. Positive case appeared in one of the hotels, and then all the people that were already in quarantine in that hotel for I don't know how many days had then to stay an extra 14 days with basically no notice. So
yeah, that's correct.
That happened to you, Juliane, but I think that's a possibility.
Thanks for the encouraging stories here.
Yeah, I mean it's also, I mean you've got no influence whatsoever in terms of the hotel that you're allocated to. So different. So this is handled quite different in New Zealand, for example. So in New Zealand, you actually book your hotel quarantine yourself ahead of time. Whereas in Australia, you arrive in Australia and then they decide which facility has capacity at the time, and that's where you will be brought to. So you've got there's no room. So you've got there's no discretion whatsoever. So you can't influence that whatsoever. And I mean, in the best case scenario, you get a reasonably big room, and potentially even a small apartment with balcony. In the worst case scenario, you're in a small room with no window, and that can be for 2 of you. So I mean, as an example, my parents were in a quarantine room for 2 weeks, I think, which was probably about 30 square meters. So it had a double bed, had a small desk, and so they were jogging on the spot and doing all sorts of other exercise. So they could try and get past. I mean, on the other hand, they were actually very complimentary of the staff. So they said that they had a daily phone call from a nurse. So they're quarantined in New South Wales. That checked on their health. They spoke to both my mom and dad at the time. So not just to the one person. They very much enjoyed the food as well. So they said it was a precursor of how it would be once they're in a nursing home, because all they were looking forward to was the food coming each day.
Well, that's good. Some positives.
That's right. That's right.
Very good. But we did. Sorry, Alexander. You go.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. I think there was also a case in Sydney not that long ago where somebody, or there's a case somewhere where somebody had, or maybe it was Auckland, somebody had been in quarantine for something like 14 days, had returned negative tests, and then left. And I think it was Sydney, because I remember reading that at the time and thinking to myself, oh God, please don't tell me that they're now going to turn around and go, oh, well, we'll have to make the quarantine 16 days or 18 days just to make sure. Because, I mean, I know, Juliane, you're fingers crossed for today. And I know that for me, my view is that while I live here and work here in Berlin, there's just no point trying to go to Australia at the moment where I take 4 weeks of annual leave in order to see family over there, but then have to spend 2 weeks of that in a hotel. The moment the government says, yes, I can quarantine at home, I would go. But while it's hotel stuff, I can't. And just as a second quick comment, I was talking to people at work here in Berlin about the Australian system and so on, and mentioning that, and they said, oh, why doesn't your mother or your sister come and visit you here? And I said, oh, because the Australian government's banned Australians from leaving Australia. And the comment was, oh, what do they think they are, the German Democratic Republic?
That's a good comment, Alexander, and I think that feeds into the question that we received in the chat from Tatiana, which is whether there is any discussion about fundamental rights in Australia, because there certainly is in Germany.
Yeah, I think I mean, interestingly, 70% of the population support the current border regime that we have in regards to our travel restrictions. So, I mean, there are some discussions to what extent this. I mean, we haven't got a Grundgesetz as such, you know. So we don't have a constitution. I mean, we don't have.
The basic rights, Steve.
Basic rights, like you have them in our Grundgesetz, you know. So.
Bill of Rights.
So the understanding.
There's no Bill of Rights in Australia.
Yeah. So the understanding is a bit different here, how people perceive that, you know. So whilst people are, some people are unhappy that they can't leave at the moment, I think overall, surprisingly, that is quite widely accepted in my experience. I'm not sure if other panel members may have a different view. They are different, had different feedback.
I agree.
Sorry, go ahead.
You go, Michael.
No, I just know from the feedback that I get. I think one of the reasons why there is very, very little pushback, relatively speaking, is that we are so largely COVID-free. And people are concerned. They say, well, this seemed to be working. Every time there's a bit of a flare up, you know, a few days of lockdown in a relatively small region, and again under control, and no, at least not a large portion of the population is prepared to risk that. And I think that's why the government has that support. And you might mean, if you look at our, you know, I think we have now about 1,000 dead people, and in Germany we had that on a day. Yeah, I think it is just a compelling argument. Not that I think that the same would work in Germany, because I mean, there's an advantage to be on an island at the other end of the world. Because I don't think that the same form of control would be working neither in the US or in Europe, for example. But I think a lot of it is that, you know, it actually is a very good result so far.
If I could add a couple of things to Tatiana's question, maybe on both on a sort of an overall level and also on a specific level. On the overall level, there isn't, I think, what I'm basing my comment here on is both my own experience of living in the country and now reading the news from there. There isn't the same concept of fundamental rights. I mean, there isn't a Bill of Rights in Australia. Occasionally, the High Court of Australia has gone and found like the implied right to political communication in a case in the early 1990s in the Constitution. But to the extent there is something along the lines of some kind of Grundrechte in Australia, the High Court has had to kind of imply them into the Constitution somewhere. There's also been cases about the right to vote and prisoners not being allowed to vote and how many years your jail term has got to be for. Bringing it down to the COVID level, I think what has already been said about by Michael about the fact that it seems to work in Australia, that I think is a compelling argument, because yeah, people aren't particularly happy. There's occasionally concepts, especially in the respect of Daniel Andrews, where he gets called Dictator Dan by some people. But I think there's a fairly wide acceptance of what has to be done to control COVID. If there is a discussion around rights at the moment, it's about the rights not so much of Australians to leave the country, but of Australians to come home. And there's talk around the fact that, well, you might be able to claim that it's a breach of Australians' human rights for us not to be allowed to come back into the country, or effectively not to be allowed to come back, because under human rights law, every citizen has a right to re-enter their own territory, as in every Australian has a right to come home. And there is some talk about how it's possibly the case that by making it so difficult to come home, the Australian government's breaching our human rights as Australian citizens, making it so difficult. But you'd have to go to the Human Rights Committee, the time that it would take, and blah blah blah. So effectively, there's no, while it might be a breach of the rights, there's no actual effective remedy to get us home.
Well, it's not that the Australian government doesn't permit citizens to come back, or permanent residents. It's just that there are no flights.
Well, I think the argument is that the national cabinet rules, where they have 4,000 quotas, then they make it 6,000. Then they say, oh, but there's an outbreak in Melbourne, so we're cutting Melbourne airport back to 0 per week. While they might not actually be saying they're banned, effectively the policies are leading to the fact that there's still, I think, 40,000 Australians stuck somewhere. And I would not count myself as one of them, because I'm not trying to get back, but if I could, I would. So there's probably a much larger number than the 40,000 registered with DFAT actually trying to get home. And things like even just the Australian Embassy Facebook page here in Berlin is full of stories every single day of people trying the hell to get home and just not being able to. And I think Juliane can send us all a message from quarantine, hopefully in about 48 hours.
Yeah, let's see about that. So we do have another question, but I would like to point out that afterwards we have to really wrap up because we're already over time. And but that's from Wolfgang, and he's like, "Hi, Martin and others. Do you think the restriction to travel in Australia is an infringement of Article 13.2 UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with which everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country, even if proportionally balancing it with the rights granted to governments with respect to health and security?" Best Wolfgang. I think that touches a bit on what we just talked about.
No, I agree. I think it's a very good question, So I think the balance really is balancing the individual right with public health. And I mean, you can agree or disagree if you think that Australia is getting that balance right at the moment. So I think that's certainly open for discussion. Is it a breach of that specific article? I wouldn't know on top of my head. So it's interesting question.
I think Tatjana is probably one who would strongly argue that it is. Because we did have a discussion Monday evening with the Berlin GAPLA members, and we had quite a bit about that.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult decision to make, and I totally understand that. I mean, you in Australia, you keep your liberties, right? You are allowed to go to restaurants and see people, and that's much better than what we have here in Germany. But on personal levels, for example, last year, my husband and I, we were concerned that maybe his parents might need some help. The fires in 2019-20, they were very close to the house of his parents. So we were like, okay, if something happens, we couldn't even come and help. We couldn't even get them here immediately. not only on a legal level, also just in fact, because we can't get a flight. All these things are, you know, just concerning. And yeah, quarantine is good, but why not doing it at home? Why do you need to stay in a hotel? And that's only a business decision, right? You want to rescue what you have in tourism and hotels. And so.
No,
I think it's, I wouldn't.
I mean, overall, I agree with you, Tatjana, that the COVID has certainly created a lot of heartbreaking and extremely difficult situations. There is no ifs and buts about it. I mean, it's on so many levels. It's quite unbelievable. I don't think that the hotel quarantine in Australia, though, has been done to rescue the hotel industry. I mean, it's too little, you know. So I mean, it's 5,000 hotel spots that you basically have per week, and it is really done, in my opinion, because you can't really trust people to actually stay at home.
Well, I think that's the difference in other countries. They trust their people, and also, you know, you check on them every now and then. Maybe not in Berlin, but in other cities.
But you know what's the difference, for example, to Taiwan, that they monitor much more strictly via their mobile telephone or apps or whatnot, where we in Europe do have a very big issue because of GDPR. So it's a big argument, and all these discussions on how the German COVID app was created, which data can it collect, which can it save. And here I'm looking at one of our attendees, Martin, because he's a data privacy lawyer. So if you want to chip in, feel free. But that was a huge point. And honestly, if you do see the results and how people deal with it, for example, in Taiwan, just because I got friends there, I'm a bit more aware of it, and how well it's working, quarantining at home, being monitored by the app, but after a couple of days then being free to leave. It's a very different situation to here, where you're pretty much not monitored, which is fine, which I get, which is what people, I guess, want here. But at the same time, you do have other restrictions that you then have to live with.
Yes, and I think part of exercising the balancing act between the individual's freedom of movement and the public health, Martin, I think is also, well, how long will this go on? How much longer will this go on for? Because of course, the longer you restrict one freedom, the heavier you have to weigh it, I think. So I know this is a very unfair question, but do you think the travel restrictions will be going for a much longer time, or do you think we're heading towards the end of it?
Well, I think, I do hope, I mean, that's speculative to some extent, of course, but I do really hope that that ultimately the vaccine will be the game changer. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, so government has 70% of the population support current border restrictions, support what has been done in regards to COVID. So, I mean, that's massive for government. That's a big tick for the government to say, yes, we are happy with what you're doing there. I mean, they're not going to risk that with an election looming later this year or early next year to let more people in. And so I think the restrictions that we currently have in place, I anticipate that they're likely to remain in place for the remainder of the year. And I do believe that we will see an easing of those restrictions once the majority of the population has been vaccinated. And once also there is further clarity how the vaccination actually, what the consequences are and how it impacts on if people can transmit COVID, if they have been vaccinated and things like that. So I think we have received quite positive reports out of Israel, where you've had, I think, more than 2/3 of the population being vaccinated now. And it appears that people that have been vaccinated are not just at a far smaller likelihood of getting ill, and it also appears that they spread it less. I understand that some airlines, such as Qantas, I believe, have announced already that in going forward, they may only allow people to board their flights if they have been vaccinated. So that's something else, and we need to keep an eye out for. But yes, so overall, it's likely that travel restrictions will remain in place for the remainder of this year. We may see changes towards the end of the year, and hopefully the beginning of next year, but it's not going to change very quickly or very soon, I think.
Okay, thank you for that prediction, Martin. While it's not what most of us would like to hear, it's an interesting insight, and you're on the, I suppose you are at the front line of the information. So thank you very much for speaking for us today. And I think we are well over time. I apologize, but it's been great to speak with everyone, and we look forward to the next chat, which we will have in a month's time. And yes, on behalf of GAPLA, thanks everyone for joining. And Juliane, special greetings to you. Have a safe day, and we look forward to welcoming you to Australia. And whilst you have to go through hotel quarantine, it sounds like you'll have a much more freedom after and once you've arrived here. So something to look forward to.
Definitely, I'll keep you updated.
Yeah. Good luck.
Thank you.